I noticed my son leaving the house every night at the same hour. One night, I followed him in the dark and waited behind the hedge. What I saw broke me. He knelt in the cold, speaking to a small grave under the churchyard tree, holding a faded photograph. For years, he had been keeping a secret ritual, a private grief no one knew about. I sat on the grass and listened until dawn. This is the story of what I learned and why I could not stop crying. If you are watching, please like and subscribe and share below. I first noticed it on a cold Tuesday night, the kind where the wind rattles the windows and the whole house feels too still. My son had been quiet at dinner, barely touching his food, answering my questions with short nods and soft hums. I brushed it off as exhaustion. Life had been heavy on him lately, and I didn't want to pressure him. But when the old grandfather clock in the hallway struck the same hour it always did before he left, he stood up slowly, almost like he had been waiting, or listening, for that exact sound. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the floor and slipped on his coat, even though he rarely wore one inside the house. Then he walked out the back door without saying a single word. I thought maybe he needed air, or maybe he wanted to take a short stroll to clear his mind. But something felt wrong. It wasn't the walk itself. It was the rhythm, the timing, the precision. Every night for the past couple weeks, he had been doing the same thing, leaving the house at the exact same minute, with the same quiet steps, the same distant expression on his face. At first, I tried convincing myself there was no reason to worry. He was grown. He had his own life. But a mother's heart knows when something is wrong. It's a kind of alarm that doesn't make noise, but it rings and rings until you can't sit still. That night, the alarm was louder than ever. When the clock struck again and the house felt too empty, I felt a sinking feeling in my chest, a weight I couldn't ignore anymore. My instincts screamed at me, "Follow him." I waited a moment, pretending to tidy the kitchen, pretending to take my time, pretending everything inside me wasn't twisting into knots. I opened the back door softly, careful not to make the old hinges squeak. The cold air hit my face, biting, sharp. I wrapped my sweater tighter around me and took slow steps onto the porch, listening for any sound of his footsteps. At first, I couldn't see him. The yard was dark except for the dim glow of the porch light. The trees cast long shadows over the grass, swaying like tall black figures. The night was too quiet. No cars, no voices, nothing. I stepped farther into the yard, feeling the damp grass under my shoes. Then I heard it, the faint crunch of movement, steady and soft. My heart sped up, my breath catching in my throat. He was walking toward the old oak tree at the far edge of our yard, the same tree where he and his older sibling used to play when they were little, the same spot where they had buried their secret time capsule so many years ago. That memory hit me so hard, my knees shook. I hadn't thought about that tree in years. I hadn't thought about the nights after the accident when my son cried himself to sleep, clutching an old stuffed toy, believing I couldn't hear him through the walls. I froze for a moment, afraid to disturb him, afraid of what I would see. But the need to understand what he was doing, why he was hurting, why he had been slipping away from me, outweighed everything else. I took a few more steps forward, keeping myself hidden behind the line of bushes. The moonlight helped me see just a faint outline of him kneeling at the base of the tree. His shoulders were hunched, his head bowed low. He looked smaller somehow, or maybe just broken in a way I hadn't seen before. He reached into his coat and pulled out something small, pressing it to his face. Even from a distance, I could see the way his hands shook. He wasn't meeting someone. He wasn't sneaking out. He wasn't hiding for the reasons I had feared. This was something deeper, something sad, something that came from years of holding in pain he had never shared. I took one small step too close. A twig snapped under my shoe. My breath caught as I froze again, afraid he would turn around and find me watching him in the dark. But he didn't move. He didn't react. Instead, I heard a soft, broken sound, a kind of whisper, mixed with a cry that shattered something inside me. It was the sound of a heart remembering someone it could never forget. And in that moment, standing in the cold night air, hidden behind shadows, I realized my son wasn't leaving the house to escape something he was leaving because he was holding on to something I had never seen, never asked about, never knew existed this deeply. And the truth waiting for me at that tree would break me in ways I was not prepared for. When I followed my son into the backyard that night, I made sure my footsteps stayed soft on the grass. The air felt colder than usual, and for a moment, I wondered if I should have just turned back inside and pretended I never noticed him slipping out every night. But a mother's heart does not ignore signs. It listens to every sound, every silence, every shift in the people she loves. So I stood there, half hidden behind one of the old oak trees, watching him kneel on the ground like he was carrying something too heavy for his shoulders. He didn't see me. The porch light didn't reach that far, and the moon gave only enough glow for me to see the outline of his figure. His hands were shaking slightly as he held something close to his chest. I felt my breath catch when I saw him tilt his head down in a way I recognized too well, the way he used to bow his head when he was a teenager fighting back tears. He was facing the small patch of earth where the grass looked uneven, a place I hadn't paid much attention to before. But now, it felt like the center of everything. I wanted to step forward right then to ask him why he was outside, why he was kneeling in the dark alone, why he had been leaving the house at the same hour each night without a word. But something inside me, a quiet instinct I had learned over many years of motherhood, told me to stop. If I approached him now, he would retreat, he would shut down, he would hide whatever truth he had been holding on to. So instead, I stayed quiet, watching him with a mix of fear, confusion, and heartbreak tightening inside my chest. His shoulders began to shake. At first, I thought it was the cold, but then I saw him wipe his face with the back of his hand. The sound that followed was soft but painful, the kind of sound someone makes when they are trying not to cry. In that moment, something inside me broke a little. No mother wants to see her child cry alone. No mother wants to see her child aching silently, carrying something they're too afraid or ashamed to share. I pressed my hand to my chest and stayed still, letting the moment unfold. He leaned forward, placing the photograph he had been holding onto the ground. Even from a distance, I knew which photo it was. The edges had been worn from years of handling. It was the one he never allowed me to move or pack away. A picture of him and his older sibling taken the summer before the accident that changed our entire family. The sight of that photograph lying gently on the earth made my knees weaken. I wanted to run to him, gather him close, tell him he didn't need to do this alone, but the way he bowed his head again, deeper this time, told me that this was not a moment for interruptions. It was sacred, painful, and private. My heart squeezed as I watched him whisper something I couldn't hear. His lips moved slowly and carefully, like he had said these words many times before and knew exactly how they were supposed to sound. I suddenly understood why he always looked tired in the mornings, why he stayed quiet during family dinners, why he sometimes stared at empty spaces like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. He had been living in two worlds. The present with us, and the past, with the sibling he still loved deeply. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. The expression on his face hit me harder than any words could have. His eyes were full of grief, but there was something else too. A sadness that had gotten too heavy to carry alone. A loneliness he had hidden from everyone, even from me. I pressed myself against the tree trunk, feeling the rough bark against my back, trying to keep myself steady. All I wanted in that moment was to walk to him, hold him, and tell him he didn't need to hide. But instead, I stayed where I was, letting him have this moment. He finally stood up, wiping his face again before slipping the photo back into his jacket pocket. The way he moved was careful, almost fragile, like someone who was carrying something far heavier than a picture. When he turned around and walked back toward the house, he still didn't see me. I waited until he went inside and closed the door behind him before stepping out from behind the tree. I walked slowly to the spot where he had knelt. The grass was slightly bent, and the earth seemed disturbed, as though he had been leaving something or taking something. Night after night, I stared at the ground and felt tears fill my eyes, hot and unstoppable. Not because of anger, not because of disappointment, but because I had just witnessed a pain my son had carried alone for far too long. And standing there, in the quiet backyard, under the dim moonlight, I made myself a silent promise. I would find out why he had been coming here every night. I would understand the truth he had been carrying, and I would not allow him to carry it alone anymore. When I think back on the years before that night, I realize how many signs I missed, how many moments slipped through my fingers because I believed things were fine when they were not. My son had always been a quiet child, gentle, soft-spoken, and deeply loyal to the people he loved. He grew up side by side with his older sibling, almost like they were two halves of one soul. They shared toys, shared clothes, shared jokes, only they understood. Even when they grew older and life became busier, their connection stayed strong. They called each other every day, even for simple things like asking what to cook or reminding each other to take medicine. When his older sibling died suddenly, it was like someone had taken a piece of him and buried it with them. I remember standing in the hospital hallway, the bright white lights making everything feel unreal. My older child was gone, and my younger son sat on the plastic chair with his hands shaking, staring at the wall. I tried to hug him, but he barely reacted. I told myself it was shock. I told myself he just needed time. People grieve in different ways. That's what everyone kept saying, so I gave him space. I cooked his favorite meals, kept the house quiet, and waited for him to open up. But he never really did. He went back to work after a few weeks, and I convinced myself that meant he was healing. I wanted to believe he was finding his footing again. What I didn't realize was that he was only learning to hide his pain better. There were hints scattered across the years, but I didn't connect them. I would find old letters tucked into strange places, behind books, under his pillow, in a drawer he rarely opened. I thought he had simply forgotten to throw them away. Once, I caught him holding one of his siblings' sweaters, his eyes red, and he said he just needed to donate old clothes. I believed him. I didn't question the extra pillow he kept on his bed or the way he avoided family events that reminded him of the past. I thought he was just busy. I thought he was tired. I thought anything except the truth, that he was breaking a little more every day while trying to hold himself together for everyone else. Looking back, I realize how often he slipped away at night. I would hear the soft creak of the back door or footsteps walking lightly across the kitchen tiles. I assumed he was getting water or checking on the house. Sometimes I would find him outside early in the morning, sitting on the porch with puffy eyes. I thought it was stress from work, pressure from life. I never imagined he was carrying a burden so heavy that he needed a nightly ritual to survive it. There were moments when he looked distant, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. At family dinners, he would smile politely but keep staring at an empty corner, as if expecting someone to join us. When birthdays came around, he always set aside a slice of cake for later, though I never saw him eat it. I thought it was just a habit, something silly he did without thinking. Now I know it was something else, a way of honoring a memory he was terrified of losing. Even his room held clues I ignored. A dusty box in the closet full of old toys, a shoebox under the bed filled with ticket stubs from childhood outings, a drawer where he kept folded notes. I found them once while cleaning, but closed it again because I didn't want to invade his privacy. It never crossed my mind that those objects were more than memories. They were anchors keeping him from falling apart. As the years passed, I noticed he grew quieter at night, and sometimes I heard soft whispers through the walls. I thought he was talking on the phone, maybe with a friend or a coworker. I never imagined he was speaking to someone who was no longer here. I blamed myself later, wondering why I didn't ask more questions, why I didn't sit beside him and force him to tell me the truth. But grief is strange. It hides behind smiles and polite words. And love, especially a mother's love, often blinds you because you want to believe your child is doing better than they really are. So when I followed him that night and saw him kneeling in the darkness, everything suddenly made sense. Every missing puzzle piece fell into place with a painful clarity. The past I had ignored, the signs I had brushed aside, the quiet sorrow he carried. All of it was standing right there in front of me, and the weight of that realization settled heavily on my chest, because I finally understood. My son had never healed. He had only learned how to grieve in silence, hoping no one would notice. In the days that followed, the small signs I had ignored for years began replaying in my mind with painful clarity, each one bringing a new wave of guilt that I hadn't seen the truth sooner. I remembered how he would come home late, slipping quietly through the back door, his shoulders slumped as if carrying a weight he didn't want anyone to notice. I remembered standing in the kitchen making tea and hearing him sigh in the hallway, long, tired breaths that sounded like someone trying hard not to cry. At the time, I dismissed it as exhaustion from work, but now I realized it had been something far deeper, the silent grief he carried every single day. There were nights when I would pass his room and see the faint light of his lamp glowing under the door. I assumed he was watching videos or reading, the way many people do when they can't sleep. But there was a different kind of stillness in those moments, a heaviness that lingered even after he turned the light off. I never asked why I never knocked. I simply walked past, telling myself he was an adult who needed space. Looking back, I wish I had stopped, opened the door, and said, "Talk to me." Maybe things would have been different sooner. I also remembered finding small objects in unusual places. A childhood letter tucked inside a sock drawer, an old toy truck placed neatly on the nightstand, a photo frame moved from the shelf to the bed. Each time, I thought he was cleaning or reorganizing. It never even crossed my mind that he might have been seeking comfort in things connected to his older brother, the sibling he lost so suddenly and so young. I didn't know he still held those items so close, as if they were pieces of a life he wasn't ready to let go of. Sometimes, when I cooked dinner, I would notice that one plate always stayed cleaner than the others. He would barely touch his food, saying he had eaten earlier or wasn't hungry. I believed him. But now, after seeing him kneel alone in the backyard, I understood that his appetite had been swallowed by grief. He wasn't avoiding food. He was avoiding conversation, questions, and moments that might force him to confront what hurt most. Even the letters I found months earlier made sense now. There had been a small box on the top shelf of his closet, filled with envelopes addressed but never mailed. At the time, I thought they were work papers or bills he had forgotten to send. But now, with the truth slowly piecing itself together, I realized they were letters written to his late brother. Updates, confessions, apologies, memories. He had been writing to someone who would never reply, just to keep the bond alive. The thought of him sitting alone, pouring out his heart into paper because he didn't know how to speak the words aloud, cut deeper than anything I had imagined. Then there were the nights when I would hear the front door unlocking, but no footsteps entering. I would rush to check, thinking someone was breaking in, but there would be no one there. Now I understood that my son had been stepping outside to catch his breath, maybe to cry where no one could see him. Grief makes people do strange things. Search for space, for silence, for moments that feel like safety. He had been searching for all of that right under my nose, and I had been too wrapped in my own routines to notice. I also remembered him staring at the calendar on the fridge every morning, pausing at one specific date, the day his brother passed. He would stand still, his fingers brushing over the number as if it were something sacred. I never asked why he did that each day. I assumed it was just habit. Now I knew it was a ritual, a quiet moment of remembrance he didn't want anyone to interrupt. Every detail, every look, every silence, every late-night moment now formed a picture clearer than any words could describe. My son had been grieving in ways I had never seen, ways he had hidden so carefully that even a mother's instincts failed to detect them. And the only time he allowed himself to fully feel that grief was at the same hour each night, under the dim light of the backyard, where he believed no one could see him fall apart. These small signs, once scattered and meaningless, now came together like puzzle pieces, revealing the heartbreaking truth. He wasn't avoiding me or hiding from responsibility. He was trying to carry a weight too heavy for one person to bear, and he had been doing it alone for far too long. The more I remembered, the more my chest tightened with regret. I had always thought I was a present mother, someone he could turn to, someone he could trust. But grief had built walls around him I didn't even know existed, and every sign I ignored had strengthened those walls. By the time all the pieces settled in my mind, I realized one painful truth. My son had been crying out silently for years, and I had been living beside him without hearing a single sound. That night became the moment everything inside me broke open, because I finally saw the truth not as a quiet suspicion, but as a living, breathing hurt my son carried alone. When I stepped closer, still hidden behind the tall hedges at the back of the yard, I saw the way his shoulders trembled, how his hands clutched that tiny photograph as if it were the only thing keeping him standing. The cold air didn't seem to touch him. He was wrapped in a sadness so heavy that even the wind felt afraid to blow too close. I watched him sink lower to the ground until he was sitting in the dirt, the moonlight hitting his face and making every tear shine like a drop of broken glass. And at that moment, I realized this wasn't just grief. This wasn't something simple. This was a ritual he had been living with for years, maybe since the day his older sibling died. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket and pulled out something else from his pocket. A small toy car, a faded blue one with chipped paint. It had belonged to his sibling when they were children. I remembered buying it. I remembered the arguments over who would hold it during long car rides. I remembered the laughter. Seeing it in his hands now was like reopening a wound I thought had closed. He placed it gently on the ground next to the photograph, the way someone places flowers at a grave. Then he whispered something I couldn't hear, but I watched his lips. It wasn't anger. It wasn't regret. It was love. Pure, painful, loyal love. My throat tightened. For years, I had believed he had found a way to move on, at least enough to live, to smile, to build a life. But now I understood. Every smile had been thin. Every moment of joy had been carefully balanced against this nightly sorrow. His pain had been silent, steady, and hidden beneath the surface like a secret river that never stopped flowing. I had missed all the signs, the way he avoided talking about certain memories, the way he held onto small objects without explanation, the way he looked out of windows at night as if waiting for something that would never return. As he sat there, he began talking softly, and even though the words were too low for me to hear clearly, the meaning wrapped around me like a cold blanket. He wasn't talking to the sky. He wasn't talking to himself. He was talking to his lost sibling, telling them about his day, asking if they remembered old jokes, apologizing for things he wished he had done differently. I saw his chest rise and fall in uneven breaths, each one sounding like it hurt. He covered his eyes with his hands for a long minute, shaking his head slowly as if trying to pull himself back together. The pain looked endless, deep, personal. When he finally lowered his hands, he took out something else, a folded letter. The edges were worn, as though he had opened it many times. Seeing him unfold it with trembling fingers broke my heart in a way I can't fully describe. When he began reading it aloud, I finally heard pieces of his voice, soft but heavy. That letter had been written years ago by his sibling, maybe days before the accident, and the words seemed to be the anchor he clung to every night. It was their last conversation, frozen in time. I realized he had memorized every word. His lips moved in perfect rhythm with the lines on that paper, as if the message inside had become a part of him. He finished reading and pressed the letter against his chest, rocking slightly, the way a child rocks when they need comfort, but no one is around to give it. Watching him like that, my grown son, hurting in silence, carrying a grief he refused to share with anyone, made something inside me crack wide open. I wanted to run to him. I wanted to gather him in my arms and tell him he didn't need to do this alone, but I also knew that walking out at that moment would break the fragile space he had created for his healing. So I stood there, heart aching, hands trembling, and let him finish his ritual without interruption. After several minutes, he whispered one last sentence into the darkness, kissed the photograph gently, and placed the toy car beside it before standing up. He wiped his tears with the back of his sleeve and took a deep breath, trying to rebuild his strength before returning inside. I watched him pick up the items carefully and tuck them into his jacket, holding them close to his heart as he walked back toward the house. His steps were slow, heavy, tired. When he disappeared through the door, I stayed outside for a long time, staring at the small patch of earth where he had knelt. The dirt still carried the shape of his hands. That night, I realized something important. Sometimes the deepest pain in our children's hearts is the pain they hide because they don't want to break ours, and it broke me anyway. When I finally stepped closer that night, still hidden in the shadows, I began to see everything he had been keeping from me. It wasn't just a simple routine or an emotional moment he repeated for comfort. It was a whole world he had been protecting, piece by piece, year after year. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw a small box beside him on the ground. It was old, wooden, and covered with scratches I remembered from years ago. It used to sit on his older sibling's desk, a simple little treasure box filled with childhood memories. I had packed it away after the funeral, thinking keeping it out of sight might soften the hurt. I never realized he had taken it, held on to it, and hidden it for himself. Inside the box, I saw small toys, letters folded neatly, and even a dried flower from a birthday bouquet. It shocked me how carefully he had kept each piece untouched, almost as if he believed his sibling would come back and ask for them someday. My heart twisted painfully. I felt ashamed that I never knew. I felt guilt I couldn't shake. I had been so focused on being strong that I never noticed the quiet grief growing inside him like a heavy shadow. As he lifted an old letter, his hands shaking, I heard him whisper, "I'm still here. I didn't forget." His voice broke, and I had to cover my mouth to keep myself from crying out. I realized then that he had been holding this pain for years, not wanting to burden me, not wanting to show weakness, and not wanting to reopen the wounds we had both tried to close. All this time, I thought he was moving on with school, work, friends, and life. I never imagined he mourned every night at the same hour. The exact time his sibling had passed. That detail made my knees almost give out beneath me. He didn't know I was watching. He didn't know I had followed him. He didn't know I was finally seeing the truth he tried so hard to keep hidden. I watched him carefully unfold a small note. I recognized the handwriting instantly. His older sibling had written it the night before the accident, planning a surprise visit for him. The note said, "Tomorrow we'll celebrate together. Just us." I hadn't known he kept that note. I hadn't known he treasured it like a last conversation frozen in time. Then he pulled out a small toy car, the one they used to race on the living room floor when they were children. He held it tightly, knuckles white, and whispered something I couldn't hear. His shoulders trembled. Tears fell one after another, soaking into the dirt, mixing with 10 years of grief. My heart broke all over again, just as it had the day we buried our child. Only this time, it broke because my living son had been grieving alone, right under my roof, and I had failed to see it. As I watched, I saw another thing he kept in that box, a watch. It had belonged to his older sibling. It didn't work anymore, the hands frozen in one moment forever. My son looked at it for a long time, tracing the cracked glass gently. I realized he wasn't just grieving, he was waiting. Every night, at the same hour, he came out to sit with those memories because he felt responsible, because he felt he had to keep their bond alive. He had carried a weight on his shoulders so heavy it could crush anyone, yet he never once showed it to me. He protected me from his pain while I believed I had already lost everything that night, years ago. I finally understood that this wasn't just a ritual. It wasn't something small or harmless. This was his way of keeping love alive. This was his way of fighting loneliness. This was his way of whispering into the night, hoping his sibling could hear him. And I, standing just a few steps away, felt tears streaming silently down my face. I couldn't step forward yet. Not then. He needed that moment. He needed it untouched, unbroken, uncorrected. I stayed hidden until he stood up, wiped his eyes, and tucked everything carefully back into the box. He held it close to his chest, as if it were the most precious thing he owned. Then he walked back inside, shoulders heavy, but steps steady. When he disappeared through the door, I finally let myself crumble, covering my mouth to keep from crying out loud. That night, I learned the truth that had been living beside me all this time. My son had been grieving in silence, loving in silence, remembering in silence, and I couldn't stop crying because I finally understood how deep his pain ran and how brave he had been to carry it alone. When I finally understood the truth of what my son had been doing every night, I knew I couldn't sit back and watch him carry that weight alone, but I also knew rushing into his pain or forcing him to open up would only drive him deeper into silence. He had made that nightly hour his private place of grief, a place he believed no one could enter. If I wanted to help him, I had to move with care, patience, and respect. So I sat at my kitchen table the next morning, hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, thinking quietly about who I could turn to. It had to be someone who understood grief, someone who knew how to help without pushing. My mind went to Linda, an old friend of mine from church, a retired grief counselor who had walked families through losses even heavier than ours. I picked up the phone with shaky hands and told her everything, how he slipped outside each night at the same hour, how he whispered to a photograph, how the grief he carried had turned into a ritual that consumed him. Linda listened without interrupting. When I finished, she exhaled slowly and her voice softened. She told me grief like his doesn't disappear. It just hides until it finds a quiet corner to settle in. She explained that some people heal by expressing, while others hold everything inside until the pressure breaks them. She offered to help him when he was ready, but she reminded me that healing couldn't be forced. She told me my role wasn't to fix him, but to guide him toward a safer path. After we hung up, I sat alone for a long time, thinking about what to do next. I realized that if I wanted to help him, I had to truly understand the depth of his pain. So I began to gather small notes, memories, and the little things I had noticed over the past few years. His unopened letters, the way he stared at the empty chair at the dinner table, the way his smile never reached his eyes anymore. I wrote everything down, not to invade his privacy, but to give Linda context, to give myself a clearer picture of how long he had been sinking. Later that afternoon, I walked quietly into the attic, unsure of what I hoped to find. There, in a worn box, I found the old belongings of the child we lost. Small toys, drawings, birthday cards. I realized he must have visited this box too, or kept his own hidden somewhere I didn't know about. Standing there holding those old memories, I felt the same ache I had felt years ago when the loss first struck our family. But now the ache was sharper, knowing my son had been carrying twice the burden, his grief and the guilt of hiding it. That evening, I met with Linda at her home. We talked for hours. She gave me steps, not orders. She taught me how to approach him gently, how to open the door without pushing him through it. She helped me understand that grief turns into shame when someone believes they are too old or too strong to cry. She told me that the first step was simply making space for him to feel safe again. When I returned home, I walked through the house quietly, realizing how blind I had been to the signs. Every room carried a piece of our shared sorrow. I sat on the edge of my bed and planned carefully. No confrontation, no sudden questions. I would give him an opening, a moment, a quiet chance to speak if he wanted to. And if he didn't, I would make sure he knew he wasn't alone, not anymore. By the time the night came, I felt ready. For the first time, instead of waiting for him to slip out into the cold darkness, I decided to be the one to break the silence, gently, with love and patience. I didn't know how he would respond. I didn't know if he would shut down or finally let himself breathe. But I knew one thing for certain. After watching him suffer in the shadows for so long, I could no longer stand by. It was time to be his strength, the way I had been when he was a child, the way his sibling had been when they were young together. And so, with steady hands and a determined heart, I prepared myself for the moment when he would walk through the door and I would finally take the first real step toward helping him heal. I waited until the next morning to speak to him because I wanted both of us to breathe for a moment. I needed my voice to be calm, steady, and full of love instead of fear. When he came into the kitchen, tired from another night of secret tears, I asked him to sit with me. He looked at me with a little surprise, maybe even worry, because he knew I didn't ask for long talks very often. I took a slow breath and gently told him that I had followed him the night before. I told him I had seen everything, the photo clutched in his hand, the tears, the whispers into the night, the items he had saved for years, frozen with memories. His face went pale, his shoulders stiffened, and he looked down at the table as if he had been caught doing something terrible. But I reached for his hand, letting him know I wasn't angry. I told him I understood why he kept it hidden. He didn't want to burden me, didn't want to reopen my old wounds, didn't want to make anyone else carry the weight of his grief. He whispered that he didn't want to be a problem, didn't want to make things harder, didn't want to show how broken he still felt. I listened quietly, letting him speak until the words shook out of him like loose stones that had been building in his chest for years. When he was done, I explained that grief doesn't get smaller just because we hide it. It grows heavier when carried alone. I told him gently that he had a choice, not a punishment, not a demand, but a loving choice. He could keep doing what he had been doing, holding his pain close every night in the dark, or he could let me help him find a way to honor his sibling while healing himself. I told him I had already found a grief counselor who could guide him, someone patient and kind, who understood how deep bonds and sudden loss can shape a person. I let him know that therapy wasn't about fixing him. It was about helping him breathe again. He looked at me with wide, confused eyes because he wasn't expecting kindness. He had expected anger or disappointment. But not understanding, I reminded him that grief makes people hide and that love brings them back out. I talked about my own silent pain after losing his brother, how I had cried after he went to bed, how I kept pretending to be strong, how the weight of moving on felt impossible. He blinked quickly, his eyes glossy, because he had never heard me say those words. He thought I had healed easily. He thought I had been the strong one, because I never showed him my broken moments. I told him healing doesn't mean forgetting, and loving someone who is gone doesn't mean living in sorrow. It means carrying their memory in a way that brings peace instead of ache. That's what I wanted for him. I wanted him to remember his brother with warmth instead of pain. I told him that his nightly ritual didn't make him weak. It made him human, loving, loyal. But I also explained that he didn't have to keep hurting himself alone. I wanted him to let someone help lighten the weight. He finally spoke after a long silence, his voice barely a whisper. He said he was afraid of forgetting, afraid of moving on, afraid that if he stopped the nightly visits, it would feel like he was letting go of the bond they shared. I held his hands firmly and told him that letting go of pain doesn't mean letting go of love. Healing doesn't erase the memory. It honors it. I wanted him to understand that his brother's memory lived in him no matter what time of night it was. I told him the truth. Watching him suffer alone broke my heart more than any reminder of the past. I told him I would stand by him through every step of healing, not as someone forcing him, but as someone walking beside him. I reassured him that he didn't need to choose between remembering and living. He could do both. It was possible, even if it didn't feel like it yet. He wiped his eyes, and for a moment I saw the little boy he used to be, the one who held his brother's hand on the first day of school, the one who cried when he scraped his knee, the one who used to run to me when the world felt too heavy. He nodded slowly, almost cautiously, and said he was willing to try, not because he was sure, but because he trusted me. That was enough. It wasn't a perfect promise. It wasn't a sudden cure. but it was a start. And sometimes a single yes, spoken through tears, is the beginning of healing. The changes did not happen overnight, and I never expected them to. Healing was not a switch we could flip. It was a slow, steady unwinding of the knots that grief had tied into my son's heart over the years. After our talk, after he agreed to let me help him, the house felt different. It was quieter, not because the sorrow had vanished, but because the hiding had stopped. He no longer slipped out like a shadow, no longer moved through the night as if he had something to protect from the world. Instead, he started to show his emotions openly, even if it was only a little at a time. He canceled a few late-night work shifts and spent time simply sitting with me on the sofa. He didn't say much, but the silence between us was no longer heavy. It was honest. There was no pretending anymore. His grief had always been a private storm, but now I could feel the winds softening. I could see the exhaustion leaving his shoulders. He had carried too much alone for too long, and the relief of finally sharing it was slowly beginning to show. The counselor I arranged for him came once a week. At first, he barely looked her in the eye. He spoke in short sentences, offering only the smallest details, but the counselor had patience, gentle and steady. She let him set the pace. She never pushed. She allowed him to admit things he had never spoken out loud. The guilt he had kept from childhood, the fear that he had not protected his older sibling, the invisible weight he had carried every night when he slipped outside to keep the routine alive. Each session opened a small window, letting a little more light into the room. I could see the difference afterward. He sat straighter. He breathed deeper. His shoulders didn't sag in the same defeated way. Sometimes he went on long walks after the sessions, as if he needed time to process. Sometimes he simply sat in his room with the door open, something he hadn't done in years, letting me know he wasn't hiding anymore. One day, about 3 weeks into the process, he came to me with the photograph he used to take outside each night. His hand shook as he held it out. I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't take it from him until he pushed it gently into my palm. It was a sign, not that he was letting go of his sibling, but that he was releasing the pain tied to the ritual. That moment broke something open inside me. I had always tried to be strong for both my children, but seeing him trust me this deeply made my chest tighten with gratitude and sorrow all at once. Slowly, the nightly routine shifted. Instead of slipping outside in secret, he lit a small candle in the living room once a week. He sat beside it and talked quietly, not to a memory, but to himself. Sorting through what he had locked away for so long, I watched from a distance, knowing this was his way of creating a healthier path. He didn't abandon the tradition. He reshaped it into something that didn't drain him. The old box of keepsakes, the letters, the toys, the little trinkets he used to surround himself with, stayed, but now he stored it carefully in a drawer rather than carrying it outside like a burden. He understood now that love didn't require suffering. Remembering didn't have to break him every night. Our bond changed too. We talked more, not about everything, but enough. He trusted me with small details, then bigger ones. He told me how he felt during the years he had kept the ritual hidden. He apologized, not because he owed me anything, but because he finally felt free enough to share. I apologized, too, for not noticing sooner, for assuming time would heal him automatically, for thinking silence meant peace. Healing became a shared journey. There were setbacks, nights when he returned to the backyard out of habit, nights when grief hit him hard and he needed space. I learned to respect that, understanding that some wounds reopen before they close fully, but each setback was followed by a step forward. He began attending small family gatherings again. He smiled at jokes he used to ignore. He called old friends he had pushed away after the loss. He even mentioned wanting to help at a youth program someday, something he had not expressed interest in for years. Through it all, I kept watch quietly, supporting him without overwhelming him. I encouraged him to keep going to counseling. I reminded him gently that grief does not disappear, but it loses its sharpness when shared. Weeks turned into months. The house slowly filled with a different kind of silence, the peaceful kind, the kind that lets you breathe deeper. the kind that holds healing instead of sorrow. The nightly ritual that once consumed him became a meaningful, manageable remembrance instead of a hidden burden. Watching him slowly reclaim his life brought tears to my eyes more times than I can count. He had been lost in a loop of grief for so long, and now he was learning to step out of it, not abandoning the memory of his sibling, but honoring it in a healthier way. The hour he once feared, the hour he once carried alone, no longer held the same power over him. He found strength again, and I found relief, not because the pain was gone, but because he finally let me carry some of it with him. After everything I witnessed and everything my son finally allowed me to understand, the house began to feel different. For years, I had believed our home was peaceful, stable, and full of the small routines that keep families grounded. But now I understood that beneath that quiet surface, my son had been carrying a grief so heavy that it shaped his life each night. The discovery shook me deeply, but it also opened a door to healing for both of us. I realized that for a long time, I had been moving through life thinking pain faded on its own, thinking time alone could fix what loss had broken. Seeing my son in the dark, crying into his hands, changed that belief forever. It showed me that silence does not equal strength. It showed me that pain finds places to hide, and unless we face it, it grows roots in the heart. In the weeks that followed, I slowly rebuilt the way I lived with my son. I watched him move through the house with a little more lightness as he started opening up. He no longer avoided eye contact when memories of his sibling came up. He no longer left the room quietly when old family photos were mentioned. I paid attention to every shift in his expression and every movement in his voice, because I understood now that noticing the small things is sometimes the only way to save someone you love. He told me about the guilt he had carried, guilt that made no sense but still held him tightly. He believed he should have protected his older sibling somehow, even though the accident had been out of his control. For years, he had punished himself silently, believing he had failed as a brother. Hearing that broke my heart all over again, because he had never spoken those words. He had been grieving alone while I had been busy pretending everything was normal. As the truth settled in, I realized how much I had missed. The unopened letters, the extra pillow in his room, the sighs he tried to hide. All of them were signs that I had ignored. I wasn't angry at myself, but I felt something heavier. The weight of knowing I could have helped sooner if I hadn't been so afraid to reopen my own wounds. Healing after loss is not a straight path. Some days, my son talked openly. Other days, he closed off and retreated into silence again. But instead of letting him drift away, I made a point to sit with him, to tell him simple stories from when his sibling was little, to remind him that grief and love come from the same place. I watched him soften over time, watched the tension leave his shoulders little by little. One day, he allowed me to see the box where he kept the keepsakes, the small toys, the birthday ribbons, the notes they used to write to each other. He held each item with a tenderness that returned the ache to my chest. I saw the child he had once been, the child who adored his older sibling, who followed them everywhere, who loved without hesitation, and I realized that his nightly ritual was not only grief, it was devotion. It was love refusing to fade. As a mother, there is no pain like watching your child carry sorrow they shouldn't have to bear, but there is also no greater honor than helping them learn how to carry it more gently. As the months passed, the nightly ritual changed. He no longer slipped outside at the same hour. Instead, we created a new ritual together. We lit a small candle on the night of the accident each year, sitting side by side, sharing memories without fear. It was simple, but it allowed him to grieve without hiding, and it allowed me to be the mother he needed, present, steady, and unafraid. The house grew quieter in a comforting way, not the tense silence of before. My son's smile returned slowly, not the bright smile from years ago, but a softer one that held both pain and acceptance. Through this journey, I learned a lesson I will never forget. Grief does not vanish. It shifts. It becomes something we learn to live alongside, and love, even when wounded, becomes stronger when shared. I also learned that being a mother does not end when children grow up. It continues through the darkest nights and the quietest moments, through every tear that goes unseen and every memory that still carries sting and warmth at the same time. Now, when I look at my son, I no longer see the young man slipping into the night to face his grief alone. I see someone who has survived something heavy and has allowed himself to be vulnerable, which is its own kind of strength. And when I think of his older sibling, I feel sadness, yes, but also gratitude for the love they left behind, a love that brought me and my son back together. Healing did not come quickly. It came slowly, through honesty, presence, and the courage to say, "You don't have to do this alone." And that is the truth I carry now. Even the deepest heartbreak can lead to deeper connection if we refuse to look away.